In the modern world, it is becoming increasingly difficult to escape from the internet. More and more each day, we're falling further into addiction cycles, dopamine loops, and despair. What started off as a hopeful ideal of technology and how it could connect us all quickly became a dystopian nightmare for the majority in the lower classes. When I was younger, you were seen as weird or antisocial to be into internet gaming, anime culture, or if you were what we now deem terminally online. But fast forward to today, and the vast majority of us can now be labeled terminally online without much overreach. What was once seen as too much if you spent more than 6 hours on your screens is now considered reduced consumption, with most of us spending 9 hours a day in front of these same screens. One of the worst and most visible side effects of this increased screen usage is the rise of social anxiety, isolation, and narcissism. Every single person nowadays seems to be living inside an echo chamber of the most niche opinions you could possibly have, and community cohesion is as a result the lowest it has ever been in the history of the human race. It's hard to socialize when you show up to a social gathering and everyone is talking about their niche such as how they collect rare anime waifus in a video game you've never heard of, or they're spouting off a political opinion that you disagree with. And with the internet being purposely designed to make you angry, dissatisfied, and most importantly to make you think that you're right and everyone else is wrong, socializing with others often feels more like arguing with wholly too much passion, or you trying to decode what you can from the micro interest of the person next to you while you shake your leg with anticipation for your turn to talk about your micro interest. People end up leaving feeling they've never actually connected with the other person, and instead it just feels like the break we get from the internet to brain dump whatever garbage we've been soaking up and offload that cognitive overload onto some unsuspecting civilian. I feel as though most people are ending up in these cycles of acting purely on survival mode instincts, unable to think about their actions in the moment, instead choosing to save those thoughts for the 3 a.m. doom scroll through the infinite timeline of your social media drug of choice. It almost feels as though we are constantly living in a series of moments that are later reflected on, rather than actually living in the moment. This constant reflection, being tinted through the negative emotions caused by the internet, as we've previously discussed, only leads to more negative feelings, such as anger at another's narcissism without reflection of our own narcissistic tendencies, or shame at ourselves for being socially awkward. Instead of ever improving, we're stuck in a literal infinite loop of making the same mistakes over and over again. The reason for this is obvious to anyone that has ever dealt with addiction, but for most who have never been addicted to anything but their phones, the language to describe what is happening simply does not exist. You can't think about a topic that you have never learned, and you can't pull magical insight without knowledge. It would be like saying a doctor of medicine should be able to solve a higher order math problem without ever actually knowing anything about math. It's not possible, and chances are he wouldn't even know where to begin. Furthering that analogy, let's say the doctor then, not wanting to look like a failure, pretends to know mathematics and throws out his algebra skills from high school until he has a solution that looks decent enough. Many would simply appeal to his authority in medicine, not realizing that has nothing to do with mathematics, while those who could actually solve the problem are relegated to the side for not having the shiniest badge of authority, such as a suffix before their name. So how do we break out of the dopamine loop, the addiction cycle, and the internet? How do we return our lives to a point where we can find happiness and reconnect with those around us? The answer lies in understanding addiction for what it is and understanding how your fancy brain chemicals actually work in practice, not just in scientific papers. So we've got here with us Tom and Larry. Tom spends 9 hours a day scrolling through social media, keeping up with the news cycles and every new trend. Larry, on the other hand, has never used a screen in his life. Let's follow Tom first and see how his average Sunday plays out for him. He wakes up at around 10 a.m. and immediately reaches for his phone. He spends about 2 hours scrolling until his stomach starts gurgling and he decides to get up and get food. He's not feeling like cooking today as he's dreading the thought of doing the dishes, and he's even dreading the thought of preparing the food in the first place. Instead, he opts to open up DoorDash and order something while he takes a shower. He puts on some music while he showers, listening to whatever comes up on his Spotify playlist, and as soon as he's done, his food has arrived. He sits down to eat, only to realize they got part of his order wrong, and what he does have seems to be lacking any meaningful flavor. It also has almost no nutrients, and when he finishes the food, he feels more lethargic than he did before. He opts to watch a few episodes of a show on Netflix while he eats, but after finishing his food, a few minutes of watching the show leads to him opening his phone, where he starts scrolling through social media with the show playing in the background. He notices this raising feeling of anxiety in his chest, so he moves from the living room up to his bedroom and lays down in bed, putting on a YouTube video to calm his nerves. A few minutes through the video and he's lost all interest, so he starts clicking through every suggestion until he finds something that just catches his attention enough for him to finish it. It is now 5 p.m. and Tom is getting hungry again. He wants to go out to eat instead of ordering DoorDash, as he remembers the lacking experience that he had earlier for lunch, so he heads out to the local eatery. He sits down and orders his food, opens his phone, and begins scrolling through social media. About an hour later, he manages to receive his food, only to realize that it was sitting under the food warmer for about 10 minutes too long, and his burger bun is about as dry as the Sahara Desert. He waves the waitress over, and before he can even begin to think about what to say, he finds himself berating her over the food in an angry tone. She offers to fix it for him, which he obliges, and it takes another 15 minutes before he has a fresh order in front of him. In the meantime, he's scrolling more on his phone. After he finishes his meal, he begins to feel increasingly more lethargic than before. He heads home but gets stuck in rush hour traffic and finds himself angrily cursing at the drivers for being on the road. After he returns home, it's about 7:30, and this time he's chosen to hop on his computer for a few hours to play some video games with his friends from work. They choose to play some multiplayer FPS game where he ends up with a 50-50 win rating due to skill-based matchmaking. Half of his games end with him angry about losing, and the other half were spent with him arguing over how stupid his teammates are and how they still manage to pull off a win despite having these people on his team. He ends up playing these games until about midnight, and realizing he has work in the morning, and at this point he'll only receive about 4 hours of sleep before the next day, he promptly heads to bed. As soon as his head hits the pillow, his mind is instantly full of rushing thoughts of anxiety. Reflection on his angry outburst to the waitress fills him with shame, and even though he tipped her well, he still feels bad about it. He ruminates in these thoughts for another hour before falling asleep, and getting only 3 hours of sleep before he has to go to work. Tom is miserable. The dopamine loop that he is stuck in forces his actions before he has time to reflect. The only time he ever had a moment of silence was the final hour of the day when he went to bed. Every other moment of his life was filled with screens, music, or commuting. And instead of ever realizing that he has just wasted the day doing nothing, he laments and tortures himself mentally for the mistakes he made. The reason why Tom is unable to break this loop is because his brain has become addicted to sources of dopamine that he has long since built a tolerance to, that he is unable to effectively enjoy anything except scrolling. And since he is unable to even entertain the thought of enjoying anything other than that, he seeks out low-effort rewards. These low-effort rewards end up being more depressing in the long run than anything else he could be doing. He also provides himself with no moments of silence to reflect and decide, meaning his life is spent almost entirely on subconscious choices. Tom is living life on autopilot, but his autopilot is broken. His autopilot has been trained by Tom unconsciously over the years by reinforcing these low-effort behaviors until the brain, which is honestly retarded, throws a temper tantrum anytime he wants to do something different. If it doesn't involve scrolling or a screen, Tom's brain throws a mental fit. It brings up and tints every thought that he could have about high-effort activities like cooking, trying to make him as mentally miserable as possible until he gives up on wanting that high-effort activity and instead seeks to quiet the tantrum through low-effort appeasement. It's like a toddler that screams their lungs raw as soon as a parent takes their iPad from them and continues to scream and rage and throw a fit until the parent inevitably gives in and lets them go back to watching AI brain rot until the child has no gray matter left in their skull. This is a key component of addiction. When the brain is unable to receive its daily dose of the drug of choice, it causes genuine psychological harm to the user until they are almost entirely working on impulse to silence the harm. The addict's brain has become an enemy to themselves. It has become a toddler screaming their lungs out. With the increasingly worsening life conditions of Tom, getting no nutrients from his food, no social interaction outside of angry outbursts, and no time to ever grow, Tom's toddler has become a monster that tortures him daily, making the cycle harder to escape. This may sound like some incredibly out there situation, but I would argue that the majority of Americans are living some version of Tom's life right now. Without any thought of how their choices affect their lives, most are living in what can only be described as a cycle of addiction. Do you think Tom is actually enjoying anything that he is doing? Or do you think that the brain is simply spurting out whatever it has left of any sort of chemical that it can because it has no choice but to use them somehow? Tom is not happy, but if you spoke to Tom, he'd probably blame his situation on being tired from work or not sleeping enough the night before. Most addicts don't want to believe they're addicted, and phone and internet addiction is no different. And I'm really trying to drive this home. You are not different than Tom if you are spending hours a day in front of a screen. You have more in common with an iPad toddler from Gen Alpha than you do with your ideal of who you should be. The first step to breaking free of addiction is to realize that you are addicted in the first place. It is so vital that you understand that because the solution to addiction is funnier and stupider and simpler than you could ever expect it to be. The actual way to break free from addiction and dopamine loops is to retrain your autopilot to enjoy doing something else. And the way to enjoy something else is to spoil the addiction by recognizing how much you actually, truly hate it. The dopamine loop is not some magical thing that knows what you need to do to be happy. It doesn't actually know what happiness is at all. It just splooges itself into your body whenever it gets stimulated, like an orange getting squeezed for its juices. And your brain, being the most monkey shit that has ever existed, wants only one thing and one thing only: more of that sweet, sweet chemical. So when you train it to splooge whenever you see flashing images and fancy colors, porn, brain rot, and short form content, your brain just goes, wow, if that's what makes me feel good, that must be where the true happiness is. And then when you try to do something else, your brain, like a toddler, says, no, I don't want to do something else. I want a brain rot. I'm going to throw a fucking tantrum, force you to think about it. I'm going to fill your body with energy until you're literally bouncing around like you haven't had your methamphetamines, and force you with all my might to give in to my temper tantrum because the only thing that makes me happy is rotting. And if you refuse to give in at that point, your brain goes, fine, if we can't have the thing that gives us dopamine, what's the point in even living? Let's make you as depressed as humanly possible if you're not listening to my temper tantrum. Let's make you suicidal. Let's forget every good thing that has ever happened to you until you're laying in a pool of tears and despair. And if you continue to refuse to give in at that point, your brain goes, all right, I'll do literally anything you want. Just please get me out of this boredom. Why? Because your brain does not know what it wants. It just knows what you give it, and it cannot think of a way to get better dopamine if it's never had that better dopamine. For your brain to be trained on addiction, it truly thinks that when you remove the source of the addiction, that it will never be able to be happy again. It is a lying son of a bitch that is, as I've said before, genuinely retarded. So let's back up a bit and follow Larry on a Sunday and see what his day looks like with no screens. Larry wakes up at 6 a.m. and he is immediately full of energy, and the first thing he does is take a shower. During this time, he thinks about what he's going to accomplish for today, as it is a Sunday and he really doesn't have much going on. After showering, he heads downstairs and makes himself a high-quality breakfast. He has the time today and finds enjoyment in the process of cooking, and even uses the time afterwards to do the dishes and clean up the kitchen and clear out the fridge for the next week's grocery shopping. After he's done, he prepares for himself a small lunch, and then Larry decides to head outside and go for a walk. There's really nowhere to go as he lives in the city, but he mostly just enjoys listening to the birds sing, watching the other pedestrians, and finds that if he's inside too long, he ends up feeling worse. And that's enough for him to go outside. He ends up at the park where he spends a bit of time reading through a book he had recommended to him, and eats the small lunch he had prepared for himself. It's around 11 a.m. at this point, and so he heads back home and spends some time doing laundry and catching up on chores. He enjoys having a clean apartment and finds that if it's too dirty, he actually feels worse. While he's waiting for his laundry to finish, he writes in his journal about the morning, and he praises himself for managing to stay productive. He takes a look in his fridge and realizes he doesn't have the necessary ingredients to make dinner, so he heads out once again to the local market. He plans to do his actual shopping for the week tomorrow, but for tonight, a quick trip to grab something for dinner is enough for him. He returns, and at this point it's around 3 p.m. He prepares the ingredients for dinner and puts on his favorite album that he had been given to him on vinyl for Christmas. He's heard it probably 100 times at this point, but still manages to catch some things throughout that he had never heard before, leading to a deeper appreciation for this music. After he finishes cooking, he sits down to eat his dinner, and then gets up to do the dishes, and then to finish folding the laundry and putting it away. It's around 7 p.m. at this point, and Larry writes in his journal about the reflection on his day, laments not having any social connection, but looks forward to tomorrow when he will be back around his coworkers. He spends the rest of his night reading through more of his book and gets to sleep around 9:30 p.m. When he lays his head down, he finds his head is full of thoughts about what else he could get up to tomorrow, and he feels at peace knowing that there is nothing to be done that is left gnawing at him. Larry spent the majority of his day not on autopilot. Most of his actions were those that he had chosen to do himself consciously, but the thoughts that came to him were not his own. No, the thoughts that came to Larry were thoughts from the working autopilot system of his subconscious. You see, Larry has the same dopamine loop that Tom does, but the difference is that Larry's dopamine loop knows that the lowest effort activity available to it are the activities that keep Larry alive and happy. Larry has never felt the addictive pull of the screens, and as such he has no concept of the low-effort dopamine available in the form of brain rot. When Larry sits down to journal, he is reflecting on his actions, and his brain, afraid of feeling less than in these moments, rewards Larry for doing the things he wants to do. Larry also makes journaling an enjoyable time by focusing on the positive experiences in his life, and when he laments on his isolation, he ends the lament with a positive feeling of fixing the issue. Do you think Larry is happy? Do you think he finds genuine enjoyment from the things he is doing? No more so than Tom. His brain does not have more chemicals than Tom. Instead, what Larry has is sensitivity to those chemicals. Instead of dopamine dumps through highly stimulating activities, Larry's dopamine slowly drips through the day and spikes whenever he has completed a high-effort task. The brain learns that if it wants to receive those dopamine spikes, it has to achieve a high-effort task, and so it pushes the body to do those tasks. Again, his brain is not special. It is just as retarded, but it cannot comprehend that it could receive more dopamine from rotting because it has not rotted. And so Larry lives in blissful ignorance, which I hope you can see in this situation is a good thing. So now that we know that your brain does not care about what actions you take, it doesn't care about what activities you do, it simply cares about seeking out those happy chemicals, we can start to understand that the way to break free from addiction is through replacing those highly stimulating addictive actions with lower stimulation, non-addictive activities that lead to the dopamine spikes in the form of completion of high-effort tasks. It's incredibly difficult at first to just willpower your way through this. It's almost impossible. Because if you don't hate the addictive thing, if you sit there missing it, you're going to want to go back to it because your brain's just going to constantly loop through throwing that temper tantrum. So if you really want to break through these dopamine spikes, the best way to do that is by just realizing that you actually genuinely hate living your life like Tom. Who enjoys living Tom's life? Like, genuinely. I don't think it's anybody. I think most people would listen to both of these stories and say they'd prefer to be more like Larry than like Tom. In both situations, they are simply doing tasks that release dopamine in their brain. But in both situations, one is doing highly stimulating, low-effort activities that lead to no growth, and the other is doing low-stimulation activities that lead to high-effort dopamine spikes that lead to growth. One of the best books that I've ever read was The Easy Way to Stop Smoking by Alan Carr, and the entire book is pretty much just this. It's basically just telling you that in order to quit, you have to really see what is happening inside of your body and really see what is happening throughout your day. And the best way to go about it, as recommended by him and honestly as recommended by me having gone through this, is to simply focus first on recognizing what's going on. Don't necessarily step in and stop it. Recognize when you wake up in the morning and and the first thing you do is reach for your phone, and make a mental note of that. Recognize every time you're sitting there and you're thinking about doing something that requires high effort, and your brain starts throwing at you these horrible like mental spirals, these mental tantrums where you sit there and you think, I want to cook, but then you immediately notice that your brain comes up with it and goes, yeah, but cooking takes so much effort. Yeah, but cooking takes so much time. You don't want to do that. You just want to scroll on your phone or get DoorDash or something. And you don't have to step in and stop it at that moment. You just have to recognize it and make the mental note and say, I hate that. I don't want to be thinking about this situation in that way. I want to think about it differently. And just do that enough times. And over time, you'll start to reach for your phone and be like, I hate this. And then you can start to be like, all right, let's do stuff I actually don't hate. And start thinking of yourself differently. The worst thing that you can do is say that you're addicted and then try to break free from the addiction by constantly referencing yourself as an addict. You don't have to say, I'm a phone addict and I'm always going to be a phone addict and all this horrible stuff, and you're constantly feeling the shame of it. Have some self-compassion. You can recognize that you're a phone addict or an internet addict at first, and then you can work to fix it. And by the time you're no longer using your phone every day, when you're ready to stop using your phone and you're ready to start taking control of your life, at that point you stop referring to yourself as an addict. Especially with Alan Carr's book, he makes the point that like you need to refer to yourself as a non-smoker when you finally do quit smoking. It's not, oh, I used to smoke, I'm a former smoker, I quit smoking. It's, I don't smoke, I don't brain rot, I don't use my phone like that, because that is what you are becoming. You are not becoming an ex-addict. You're becoming a non-addict, and you don't want to constantly refer to yourself as an addict because it just gives your brain that foothold to start torturing you again. So it's very important to have self-compassion. So I hope you guys learned something here. I really don't like doing synthesis because I think synthesis is just, it just takes away the actual effort that you have to put into thinking about this yourself. But come back and listen to these two stories if you just really want to kind of understand how your day-to-day can look and be different when you finally break away from addiction, from phone addiction, from whatever addiction that you're stuck under, internet addiction, and get back to the retaking your dopamine and actually retraining it and retaking control of your life. And that's really what this is. It's retaking control of your life. So if you learned something, please stick around. I have more content that I'm going to be creating. I think the next thing I'm going to do is I don't know what my next video is going to be, but I'm excited to build this channel. I'm excited, and I can't do it without you, because there is no point in speaking to the void. There is no point in speaking to nobody. So if I'm speaking to people and I'm actually reaching people and I'm actually really helping you, then please stick around and help me reach more people. Thank you.